Dawn on August 5th, 1864. The mouth of Mobile Bay breathed fog and heat in equal measure. On the mizzen of a black-hulled flagship, a man in a blue coat climbed higher than any admiral ought to climb, and lashed himself to the rigging because vision lives above hesitation. The fleet below him muttered with boilers and nerves. Off the port bow, a line of buoys marked a place where the water had learned a new word: torpedo. In the parlance of the day, that meant a mine asleep in brown depth, waiting with a patience no human can match. A lieutenant of engineers, hair plastered to his forehead by Gulf humidity, stood amid coils of chain on the deck of a hired tug. He was not important on paper. He was not a famous name. He had brought to the bay a contraption that his betters called crazy. He called it a trap, not for men, for torpedoes. It was a raft of planks stiffened with spars, draped with chain and scrap iron, with two lumbering sweep booms trailing like the whiskers of some crude fish. The tug would nose this contraption into the channel like a man testing a floorboard with his weight before he leaps. If the floor gave, the raft would explode instead of a ship. If it held, a lane would open. The lieutenant had argued for weeks that fear is a weapon you can trick if you give it something else to bite. The argument had not been philosophical. It had been a chess match with the clock running. The clock was weather, tides, and an army ashore that needed the bay opened. He had met skepticism in orderly rooms and on quarterdecks where seasoned officers weighed risk against doctrine and found doctrine heavier. Mines were the enemy's pet. Mines did not play fair. You swept and you still feared, because fear can swim. The engineer said, "Let me put a clattering target ahead of us, a false bow for the torpedoes to kiss. Put a wooden decoy in the water with iron teeth that will snag the triggers and a belly sturdy enough to take a bite. Put a little madness between us and the unseen." They called it crazy, and the word stuck to him like brine. He wore it with the stubborn good humor that saves inventions long enough to be tested. His trap took shape in the weeks before the fleet gathered, in a yard that smelled of pitch and salt and fresh-cut pine. He bribed carpenters with coffee and stories. He stitched chain through holes bored in planks, as if he were sewing a rough coat for a giant fish. He bolted on scrap from a broken anchor so the raft would ride low enough to poke at the depth where torpedoes slept. He begged hawser and begged forgiveness from a boatswain he outranked on paper and never in spirit. He drew a diagram for the admiral's staff that looked like a child's sketch of a jaw with too many teeth. What he wanted was simple: a moving mat between the enemy's mines and the flagship's timbers, a thing to eat the shock and the shame before the shame reached men, a sweep to cut buoy lines and a curtain to catch contact prongs, and a belly to thump detonators before the keel touched them. Simple ideas are heavy when you try to lift them into practice. He lifted. He tested his raft on a sandbar where it could ground without breaking, and he could adjust the draft with casks and stones. He taught a tug to tow without yawing. He taught a crew to steer by feel through chain that wanted to snarl. He made notes in a pocketbook streaked with tar that he would never be able to clean. The night before the fleet went in, he lay awake on deck and listened to boilers breathe like sleeping animals. He thought of the men who called his idea crazy. He agreed with them and still believed. In war, belief is not hope. It is calculation with the lights out. He calculated till dawn. Mobile's defenses were not a rumor. Fort Morgan's guns looked down the main channel. Fort Gaines answered from the western side. Between them, the Confederates had strewn the water with torpedoes, anchored by chains, tipped with glass and primers and metal pride. A path closer to the forts had been left partly open, and then perhaps not. Buoys lied by design. The ironclad Tennessee lurked behind the line like a bear invited to a dance, only when the music pleased him. Every cutter and gunboat captain in the Union flotilla had stared at the charts until the paper blurred and saw, in the blur, one ugly truth. Speed is life under forts. Speed is death over torpedoes. The admiral in the rigging understood both truths and refused to choose one without the other. He would have speed. He would cheat the torpedoes if he could. The engineer and his raft were his cheat. Not an official one, not a doctrine yet. A bet. He made room in his order for a tug to tow a contraption ahead of his column. He gave the lieutenant a look that said, "Do not die for a machine, and do not make me regret believing in a stranger who makes rafts from chains." The lieutenant saluted. He felt smaller than the salute deserved and bigger than his rank permitted. He climbed to his tug with a heartbeat that drummed Morse code messages only he could read. At first light the trap touched the water, heavy and low. Chain whispered as it sank. The booms spread. The tug took strain, and the raft moved, a slow mouth tasting the channel. Behind it the column formed, double file, wooden ships lashed to ironclads, screws turning, men pacing by their guns and pretending to listen to orders while they really listened to themselves, remember names they meant to speak again some day. The admiral's glass sought the line of buoys and the darker ripple behind where the tide tugged at ropes under the skin. He saw the tug nudge the first buoy aside. He saw nothing explode. He breathed. He did not say the famous words yet. Those would come later, almost without thinking, a sentence that posterity would hammer flat. On the tug, the engineer watched the raft work. It lifted and settled in a rhythm only the channel could teach. When a chain below met a chain above the raft, twitched and held, and the stern of the tug sagged, and a boatswain swore, and then the thing came free, and the trap dragged a new line with it like a fish with two nets on its mouth. A buoy bobbed and went flat as if ashamed. The engineer's hands shook on the rail. He made them stop by will. He had made this. It was either enough or it was art. The fleet crept into the throat of the bay. Batteries woke. Fort Morgan threw great handfuls of iron. Shot sailed low over water and shrieked like horses. Shells rose and wrote hot words no one could read. The first ironclads answered. A wood ship lashed to iron flinched and held. The admiral in the rigging watched for smoke and wake, and for the worst thing, the white pillar that is a torpedo's signature. He saw none. He saw a tug and a raft, and a trail of chopped rope like seaweed strewn behind a plow. Then the worst thing happened anyway. A monitor, restless and brave, swerved outside the tug's little lane and drove toward the fort's guns to bring her own to bear. She crossed the line and entered the classroom where minds give lectures without words. The torpedo under her chose its second and spoke. The white pillar rose and the ship shuddered into a brief, unhappy angle. Men vanished. Timbers groaned. The engineer on the tug went cold through the spine because nothing teaches like watching the thing you fear perform exactly as advertised. The admiral saw his column hesitate. He understood instantly that hesitation is Torpedo's true ally. He shouted what the world remembers, a synthesis of anger, calculation, and the refusal to let a single blast right the rest of a day. Damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. The words are what history kept. The trap is what kept the words from turning into a suicide note. The tug nosed its mat harder into the buoys. The sweep lines thrummed. The chain coat rasped. Twice the raft kicked as if a beast below had butted it. Twice the tug's crew braced for light and water and never saw it. If the devices were there, they were old or wet or fooled. If they were not, the trap advanced in a channel that only looked mined. It is sometimes hard to separate courage from engineering. They embrace when it matters. The admiral drove his ships into the lane the raft had scuffed into being. The flagship's wake boiled across a map that someone ashore would later insist could not be crossed by any sane man. Perhaps that was true. The fleet did not ask sanity for permission. Guns and smoke and iron did the rest of the day's loud work. The Tennessee came out to fight and was mauled into submission. Forts that had believed in maps learned to fear improvisation. The fleet anchored in water it had not owned that morning. The men who lived wrote their letters. The men who did not become names and stories and curses spoken softly by friends. The engineer sat on the tug and looked at his raft, torn in places, dented in others, littered with weeds, scraped by metal he preferred not to name. He counted the ships that had passed behind him. He counted them twice, and then put his head in his hands and let the noise of victory wash over him until he could stand it. If you tell the story with only the famous line, you miss the small madness that preceded it. The torpedo trap was not doctrine. It was one man's wrong-shaped idea hammered into usefulness by stubbornness, and the Navy's occasional willingness to borrow from anyone who might hand it a new verb. It did not stop every danger. It did not save every ship. It created a lane where a lane had to exist, or the whole operation would have frozen under the guns. That is enough. That is more than enough, in a war where minutes carve monuments on the map. Let us walk backward and forward in time to assemble the full chain of cause and effect around that morning. Before the battle, Union and Confederate engineers had been playing chess with mines for years. On every contested river, the South tied powder to anchors and wires to shore. On every ship that dared a channel, the North learned to sweep with grapnels and prey with sailors' jokes. The Confederate word torpedo meant any infernal device that could hide under brown water and bite a hull. Some were contact, some electrical, some as simple as a keg with a striker and the devil of good timing. The Union's answers included daring, habit, and every practical contrivance an anxious mind could imagine. The trap at Mobile Bay was a culmination of those anxious minds. It was a rolling broom and a shield, a winning argument that you can make the first move against a machine that is waiting for you to come to it. After the battle, the lesson hardened into a law. If you must go through a field, put something in front that is cheaper than the ship you mean to save. If you must choose between slow fear and fast risk, choose fast risk somewhere you have prepared the ground with smarts. If you must invent, invent with wood and iron you can find in a yard behind a dock, not with dreams of factories you do not own. And do not forget the way a small machine can steady a big man. The Admiral's order sounds like a dare to the gods. It was also a decision made possible by evidence he could see with his own eyes: a tug, a raft, a path. Courage is heavier when it is supported by a plank you trust. The lieutenant of engineers did not receive parades. He received a handshake and an assignment to write down what he had done so that others might improve it. He did so in sentences that sound like instructions to build a fence. Cut spar to such and such a length. Bore holes for chain at intervals of so many inches. Stitch chain in this pattern to prevent snarling. Make fast to tug by balanced bridle so that the sweep does not yaw in current. Test on shoal water. Replace broken links. Add scrap to lower the nose to a point 3 feet below the surface at 3 knots. There is no poetry in his prose. The poetry is in the wake his raft left, across a chart others had called impassable. We can spend the rest of this hour unrolling the story in rings that move outward from that deck and that raft. The first ring is technical. What does it mean to sweep a minefield with a moving mat? It means accepting that you will never be sure and choosing to be less unsure rather than pretending you can be certain. It means trusting that a few detonations against your contraption are preferable to one against a hull filled with men. It means setting your draft so that you touch the depth that enemy designers intended, not the safe depth where their devices never live. It means towing with steadiness so that the mat does not surge and ride up and over danger like a careless boot over a snake. It means measuring, then adjusting, then measuring again, a dance of inches that keeps ships in feet and yards of life. The second ring is tactical. Fort guns punish pause. Mines punish haste. The trap buys just enough speed for the admiral to give forts less of what they want without giving mines everything they demand. The fleet at Mobile Bay moved in double column to shorten the time under the heaviest guns and to let iron mothers carry their wooden children past the worst moments. The trap widened the narrowest place by a few invisible yards. Invisible yards are priceless. They are the argument a captain can make to his own spine when he wants to keep moving after a sister ship has just disappeared in spray. The third ring is operational. Opening Mobile Bay meant cutting one of the last important Confederate ports. It tightened the blockade not by inches but by months. It promised an army ashore that the Navy would not be stopped by men with wires. A trap on a tug, tested in a backwater and dragged into the teeth of a fort, bent an entire campaign's curve. This is the invisible math of war that veterans know and civilians sometimes forget. A small improvement in a small minute can steal winter from an enemy who needed it badly. The fourth ring is human. The lieutenant, who was called crazy, invited laughter as armor. He knew you cannot sell a fearful idea if you cannot be laughed at while you sell it. He had to stand by the rail of a tug while men with harder faces than his watched for him to fail. He had to own the failure if it came. He had to own the success with the same quiet. Men like him rarely end up in paintings. They end up in footnotes written by other men like them. Their reward is to live long enough to see some younger engineer call their careful work old-fashioned and outdo it. That is the only immortality an inventor has any right to ask. Let us go back onto the water and walk the minutes as if we can slow them, because the shape of the minutes teaches more than any speech. The tug noses left to kiss a buoy, and the raft's chain sighs as something below rubs it like a cat does a door. The engineer looks aft and sees the flagship's bow fill his world. He knows the admiral is up there, tied to knowledge and wind. The monitor off to starboard moves like a man with a purpose too fast for the path permitted. She goes, and then she is gone in a spout and a lean that freezes every other wheel and heart. The admiral's coarse, holy sentence flies down the wind. The tug captain glances back as if to confirm that the words are aimed at water, not at him. Then he opens his little throttle as far as he dares, because orders given from a mast turn into lives in his wake. He is towing not just a raft, he is towing permission. The raft clatters as a chain trips across its teeth. A buoy disappears. A line of bubbles boils where a line had been. The tug takes a heave as if a giant hand pushed against its stern. The engineer and the boatswain lean together into the swell of the pull. Then the pull lets go, and the raft slews 2 degrees, and the bridle complains, and then quiets. Behind them, the flagship's cutwater splits their foaming path. Her bow brushes within a ship's breadth of the raft's port corner. The engineer wants to close his eyes and has to keep them open because watching is his only contribution to courage. If he looks away and something happens that looking might have prevented, he will never forgive himself. So he watches. He does not blink. He envies the admiral, who can look away when the time comes, because looking away is not flight from fear. It is the act of looking forward to steer men into tomorrow. History will not grant the trap the status of a hero. It will reserve that for names on admirals' lists and for the hammed phrase about dam and torpedoes that schoolchildren will one day recite without knowing what a torpedo was in that century. That is fine. That is expected. The trap will remain in the shadow where humble tools live. But anyone who has ever taken a risky step in the presence of men he respects knows what the engineer did that morning. He put his body near the machine he believed in. He did not hide behind the value of the ship he wanted to save. He inserted cheap wood and cheap iron between powder and a hull full of pay books and letters. It is a small sacrament of this war. It deserves the dignity of being told aloud. We can fill the rest of our time with the broader artillery of the Bay battle because gunnery and mines shared the water that morning. Fort Morgan's embrasures coughed heat, and packed sand flew back from muzzle blasts like the breath of some beast. Union ships replied with 9-inch and 11-inch shells that banged the fort's faces and shook men inside. The lesson that day was not that guns are obsolete because mines exist. The lesson was that neither cancels the other. Mines shape a fleet's path. Guns punish it for obeying. Only an interlocking answer works. A trap to clear a lane. Discipline to hold speed. Armor to carry wood, concentrated fire to break an iron enemy who looks invulnerable until he is not. Every piece has a moment. The trap gave the other pieces their time to act. Interlude on failure, because the mine under the monitor is the truth we must not dodge. No trap clears everything. No raft rests on the right depth for every moment of tide. No engineer calibrates perfectly when men are shooting at him. The machine that saved many lives did not save that one ship. That is not a contradiction. It is war's arithmetic. We mourn the monitor and we honor the trap. We let both facts live together so that future men understand that saving many is not the same as saving all. The engineer carries that bitter knowledge his whole life. He will tell the story of his raft when asked. He will lower his voice when the monitor's name is spoken. He is honest. He is not a salesman. He is a man who learned to measure luck and skill with the same ruler. Spend a few minutes with the Confederates ashore, because the story breathes better when both lungs expand. The torpedo men who laid the field knew their work. They had placed devices in patterns calculated to tempt pilots into what looked like lanes. They had tended lines in tide and replaced duds and taught youngsters to listen to water as if it could inform on itself. When the Union fleet came on, those men did their own watching and waiting. Some pressed keys and cursed when nothing answered. Some heard a distant muffled thump and put their fists in their mouths because they knew what that meant. Some saw the raft and laughed, calling it a junkyard. Some stopped laughing when buoys moved and devices wandered free like dogs that had slipped their leashes. Defense has its own traps. Nature is one of them. If you are not careful, your own river cheekily hands the enemy a gift. Tactical myths bloom after any fight. One says no torpedoes ever worked that day, and all work was theater. Another says the trap itself was a fraud, and only the admiral's shout mattered. Another says a sandbar saved the flagship by happenstance, and all engineering was vanity. Myths grow where pride needs a simpler story than truth. The fuller story is kinder to more men. Torpedoes worked and failed. The trap worked and failed. The admiral chose and could have chosen otherwise. Sandbars exist and sometimes are angels. The best tale is the one that lets you learn, not the one that lets you brag. Let us close the technical manual the lieutenant wrote with a few lines in his own voice, translated into ours for clarity. Build simply. Drag honestly. Accept incomplete safety over paralyzing doubt. Put cheap things in front of dear things. Trust evidence more than hunches. Respect tide. Respect fear. Respect the fact that some mornings a plank and a chain will buy you a mile of water. And if the admiral shouts something large, be very small and very steady, because great words need humble wheels to ride on. We are not out of minutes. The hour asks for context that stretches wider than this bay. The war had been teaching navies to improvise since the first river patrol exchanged shots with a shore battery that called itself a fort before it deserved the name. Iron arrived and upset the manners of men who loved oak. Steam arrived and upset the timing of men who loved wind. Mines arrived and upset the arrogance of men who loved charts. In every case, the first answer was not elegant. It was honest. A chain draped over a raft. A spar lashed to a gig with a can of powder on the end. A trawl between two boats. These ugly first answers are how a service survives contact with a new noun. Mobile Bay occupies a place in that grammar as the chapter where improvisation, nerve, and the dull labor of men with wrenches married for an hour. It was not the first time a sweep had been tried. It was not the last time a monitor would die. It was an instance where one engineer's obstinate contraption let a flag officer make a decision history would call courage, and the officer would privately call calculation. The difference between those two words is sometimes only a plank thick. The plank held. Picture the raft now in a museum that does not exist, because these things do not get saved. It would smell of tar long after the last repair. It would be scarred where iron had scraped it. It would look like a raft a child might draw if asked to make a boat that could fight a river. People would walk past it toward a cannon with prettier lines. That is fine. We carry the raft here in a story spoken slowly enough that every nail has time to matter. A last return to that lieutenant, not to gild him, but to keep him visible. After the battle, he wrote to his father and did not mention the word hero. He mentioned weather and chain and the way a tug steers when a drag tries to own it. He mentioned a man he did not know by name who had died on the Monitor, and how the sound of that ship lifting had rung in his teeth. He wrote that it is a strange thing to build a machine whose success is a silence where a detonation might have been. He said that he would sleep very little and then very hard, in that order. He signed with love, because love is the only reason men make machines to keep other men alive. This was a battle filled with heavy nouns: fort, ironclad, torpedo, battery, bay. But a light noun tips the scale: raft. A raft of planks and chain, dragged ahead of fear by a small boat that knew how to be brave. It is tempting, when we talk about war, to fall in love with armor and caliber and weight. Today, we fell in love with a thing that floated because a tired, stubborn man needed it to. If that feels unsatisfying to those who want a sharper blade, consider the sharpest thing in the story. It is the edge of a decision that slices hesitation into action and finds a path in water that had been convinced it had none. We can give the floor, in closing, to the admiral and to the engineer together, though they never spoke in any way we can quote. One said, "Full speed ahead." The other said, "I have made a small path where speed can live." Between those sentences, a fleet found a way through a field that thought itself a wall. The day belongs to both men. The memory belongs to anyone who has ever hammered chain through wood and thought, "Please let this be enough." Often it is. Once, in a certain bay, it was. If you need a lesson you can carry into rooms far from water, carry this: genius sometimes looks like junk until the minute it saves you. Courage gets the headlines, but the quiet, crazy contraption often buys the ink. How one engineer's crazy torpedo trap saved Farragut at Mobile Bay is not a secret anymore. It is a story about a raft that fed fear before fear could feed on men. It is a story about a tug that towed luck into being. It is a story about an admiral who trusted a stranger long enough to be remembered forever for trusting himself. And it is a story about a morning when the water learned a new habit. It learned that some men will always look for a way to go forward, even when the chart says no. On that morning, a plank and a chain scratched yes into the surface of a bay. The trap had a history before it had a name. Months earlier, on lesser rivers, sweeps had been tried in timid forms. 2 launches towing a chain between them to snag buoy lines. A schooner with a spar dragging a rake. Successes were small and failures were loud. The lieutenant collected these anecdotes the way a smith collects scrap. He made himself a museum of other men's mistakes, and then he built from it. He did not despise failure. He kept it in a notebook, underlined, and wrote C also beside each story so that he could remember which variables had ruined which plans. The shoreline taught as much as the yard. Where reeds bent a certain way, a buoy would drift. Where a bar threw a curl even at slack tide, a rope would scuff. He learned to walk a bank like a hunter, noting sign invisible to enthusiasts. He was not hunting ships. He was hunting certainty in a war that ate certainty for breakfast. Every contraption has a philosophy, even if the builder never writes it. The trap's philosophy was 3 words: sacrifice the cheap. That sentence makes soldiers wince because it sounds like ingratitude toward the lives that ride behind the machine. It is the opposite. The cheap thing in this equation is wood and chain. The dear thing is a ship. The dearest are the men. Sacrificing the cheap is the moral act. It is the discipline of a quartermaster turned into a hull form. A nation that forgets this, that goes to war without buffers between fragile lives and new dangers, pays interest on that forgetting for a century. The morning after victory, every navy invents a myth that it prefers to the truth. Some officers said the mines must have been dummies, waterlogged or deliberately inert. Others decided that Providence had bent the path of detonations around favored hulls. The lieutenant was unmoved by both hymns. He walked his raft and counted scars. He lifted links that had stretched under strange loads and measured the stretch with a strip of tallow like a tailor. He sketched the exact pattern of weed embedded in one corner, then sent a very junior officer to find a current that could have done that and chart its probability. When he was done, winning had become work again. The myth-makers found him intolerable. The survivors found him soothing. The admiral understood something about theater that morning, and he did not waste it. His shout was for his men and for the enemy and for himself. But he also arranged his column like a stage manager. Double column, irons with wood on the offside, so that a hit would not spin a ship's flank to the fort's muzzles. The trap's lane down the mined side meant he could risk less on the fort's side. He did not bet everything on prayer. He bet a careful man's contraption against a nervous river, and when the banked shot from Morgan's guns blinded whole sections, he had the tempo to keep going because a tug had already earned him seconds. Admirals spend currency minted by engineers and stokers. The best of them know the exchange rate. Stand for a moment in the casemate of the Tennessee and look outward, because the enemy's courage is part of your story, whether you welcome it or not. The ironclad moved with the pride of a slow predator. She had dreamed of ramming and of shrugging off shot like rain. She did ram, and she did shrug, and then a lattice of concentrated attention from many ships found her seams and her rudder and her will. The trap did not beat her. The trap made sure the men who could beat her lived long enough to focus. To care for your own small lever in a great fight, you must respect the other levers, even those that belong to men you hate. The torpedo men ashore had their own lieutenant, equally stubborn, equally convinced his craft would right the day. He had tested fuses in kitchen tubs and in creeks. He had learned which wires died first when the weather turned. He had shouted at boys to stop running near a coil that could kill them twice. He watched the fleet and pressed when he should have pressed, and sometimes nothing happened, and sometimes he saw a spout and knew he had moved a line on a map without moving his boots. When he heard of the raft later, he dismissed it with a snort, and then, in private, he admitted that improvisation attracts improvisation. He did not like the symmetry. War rarely asks our permission to be symmetrical. We can count the minutes as coin and ask what was purchased. The trap bought momentum. Momentum bought courage. Courage bought fire control. Fire control bought a dead ironclad and sullen forts. A dead ironclad and sullen forts bought a bay. A bay bought a city that would starve the Confederacy a little faster. A starving Confederacy bought a shorter winter for prisoners and for children far from any map. This is not sentimentality. It is the ledger of cause and effect, written in smaller and smaller fonts until it reaches the kitchen table. Now, go back to the carpenter's yard and watch how the odd device taught men to speak to each other. A boatswain with tattoos older than the lieutenant taught him how to lace chain so that it would not chatter itself to death. In return, the lieutenant taught the boatswain how to read a sketch for balance and how to test a bridle by touch. Two worlds met over a plank. This is how good navies get better, not by orders from on high, but by men exchanging practical nouns until their sentences describe the same reality. There is a flavor of fear that hovers around minds that we should name. It is not the fear of a visible gun or a known storm. It is the fear of randomness that has been given a trigger. Men can fight many things. They struggle with the unseeable. The trap put a shape into the unseeable. It told men, if a thing happens, it will happen to this mat first. That promise steadied hands. Steady hands keep columns tight and guns cool. Cool guns hit. Hitting saves lives. A chain stitched through pine is a pill against a particular disease. The prescription was crude. It worked. Inelegance is a virtue in first answers. The trap was ugly and heavy and hard to steer. It also was buildable in a backwater with tools on hand. Elegance that cannot be built in time is vanity. The lieutenant would have preferred elegance. He was a reader of journals and admired machines that seemed to think for themselves. He did not have that luxury. He fought the clock with a clock made of wood. The result off Fort Morgan proves that beauty can be postponed when time is the better artist. Imagine a counterfactual because it sharpens gratitude. Without the trap, the column hesitates longer after the monitor dies. The admiral still speaks, but the pilots do not entirely believe. The lane is imagined, not scratched. The buoys, not nudged aside, still print dread onto men's eyes. More ships drift too near the fort in their attempt to give the torpedoes a wider berth. More plunging fire rips decks and lines, and the morning lengthens into an afternoon of loss. Perhaps the end result is the same, because courage is stubborn. But the price is dearer. The dead are more numerous. A winter somewhere else is longer. The trap is not salvation. It is a discount applied to the butcher's bill. The phrase saved Farragut is simply a way to say shortened his odds. No device removes risk. What it can do, if made and used by men who know their business, is turn a bad bet into one a professional would accept. A famous quote does not sail by itself. It needs a hull. On that hull was a raft. On that raft was the work of hands and the nerve of a man willing to be laughed at. That is as close to salvation as this world offers. We will end this long telling by widening the lens beyond the bay and beyond the war. The principle on display is general. When faced with a field of hidden risk, put a sacrificial instrument ahead of the valuable payload. Make it cheap, make it honest, make it easy to repair, make it simple to teach, and then train men to use it until they are bored enough to be brave. Honor the boredom. It is the surest sign that a new practice has become a habit. From river to harbor to ocean and into future wars, that habit travels under new names with new materials. But at its heart, there is still the same stubborn lieutenant teaching a reluctant service how to say yes to a narrow path. Add the chapter that no one writes because it is not heroic, and yet it decides futures. The day after battle is paperwork. The lieutenant sat with a purser and a clerk and wrote descriptions of links and boards and how many had cracked. He requisitioned chain in lengths that seemed ungenerous to the quartermaster until the quartermaster read the column that showed how many feet had been lost to snag and surge. He listed men by name who had bled on the raft and asked for them to be paid as if they had been under fire, because they had been. He argued for a second tug because redundancy is the favorite virtue of men who learn to mistrust luck. He sent a note to a shipwright asking for oak instead of pine for the forward crossbeams, not because oak is romantic, but because oak bends and then remembers its shape. Write the letters that never make it into books. He wrote to his mother and did not confess fear so much as fatigue. He wrote that the admiral had looked taller than the mast for a moment, which is an illusion that admirals earn. He wrote that he had seen the sea lift like a curtain twice and fall into shreds, and that no painting would get the light right. He wrote that he had borrowed coffee from sailors without asking, and returned their cups with thanks, because a man with a raft has no pockets large enough for everything he must carry. He wrote that he would try to come home when the bay learned manners again. He signed with a hand that finally shook, because the day after is when hands shake. The forts became classrooms after their flags came down. Engineers walked the parapets and traced the lines of sight to buoy fields that no longer mattered. They asked Confederate torpedo men to talk them through their own maps, and some did, with a pride that did not dissolve in defeat. They admitted which devices failed and why. They described the night a storm had moved a whole string and how they had chased it with gigs and curses. They drew with sticks in sand the way a wire must be tied to a stake if one wants to avoid chafe against barnacle and brick. There is generosity in professionals who have been enemies the day before. It is not forgiveness. It is the recognition that craft survives flags. In New Orleans, months later, a yard crew built 3 more traps by the lieutenant's pattern. They did not call them his. They called them necessary. The plans had been refined. The chain stitch had changed so that force spread across boards like fingers instead of knuckles. The bridle geometry made it easier for a tired tug to keep the raft true in a cross tide. A new trick was added, a trailing drag that picked up cut lines so that buoys would not drift into the next ship's way. The lieutenant was elsewhere by then, and another man took the test rides. He wrote to him and said, "Your foolish idea is now a department." The sentence pleased them both. Open a page on the Confederate side again. They studied the Union trap with the same hungry attention. They asked whether a false buoy line could draw a raft into harmless water, while true devices waited elsewhere. They built decoy triggers that clacked and tugged and made sweeps misbehave, wasting time that a fort could spend loading. They told their river pilots to treat rafts as ships, to feint toward them with gunfire that made tug captains panic into bad water. The duel continued, quieter, meaner, less visible to the newspapers. That is where real doctrine grows, in seasons after headlines. Tell the story of one tug skipper because his craft is always a supporting character and deserves a line of its own. He had a scar that the crew said was from a jealous husband and was really from a snapped hawser. He had a way of standing with his knees unlocked so that he floated above his deck as if he were part of the boat, not a man on it. He lived in the space between too slow and too fast. Too slow, and the raft yawed and hunted and might bite a hull behind. Too fast, and the raft rode up over danger and left a ship to take the true bite. He felt water through rope, through wood, through chain. He was a musician in a genre only a dozen men on that bay understood. If anyone saved the Admiral, it was as much the man holding that sweet spot of speed as the man shouting from the rigging or the man who paid chain through holes with a mallet and a prayer. We should address the phrase, "Damn the torpedoes," with the care it deserves. It sounds like an order to ignore danger. It was an order to defy paralysis. The Admiral had watched the trap move and the column form and a ship die, and he understood that a second of doubt would become 10, then 60, then a day. He chose the sin of action over the sin of drift. His profanity was not contempt for the enemy's devices. It was contempt for the part of a sailor that would rather wait for a perfect world than make a decent lane in an ugly one. That is leadership that has nothing to do with slogans and everything to do with timing. If the trap had failed in some grand and spectacular way, if it had set off 3 devices at once and broken its own back and the tugs, what then? The column might have recoiled. The day might have been postponed. The Admiral's sentence might have been remembered not as courage, but as folly. The lieutenant would have carried a private gall as heavy as iron. Yet the attempt would not have been foolish even then. Demonstrations teach. The next version would have been stronger, the bridle longer, the chain doubled, the tug larger. This is how a fleet learns. Failure, then iteration, then doctrine. It is not generous to demand success the first time a new thing meets a new danger. It is wise to demand improvement the second time. Add a strand about the men on guns, because rafts do not replace gunners. They are partners. On the flagship, crews worked the heavy Dahlgrens in a heat that oiled the lungs. They swabbed, loaded, ran in, trained, waited for the roll, fired, and watched through powder smoke for the white scars their shells left on masonry. On other decks, rifle guns drove bolts that skipped and then bit where timber met iron on the enemy's ram. Every well-placed round extended the time the trap bought. Every misfire or premature burst stole it. The arithmetic of a day's fight is a ledger drawn by many hands. If the trap was the first line of credit, gunners made deposits with interest. Insert a late-hour walk through a quiet fleet. After sundown, the bay sighed as if relieved that men had finally stopped shouting at it. Lanterns picked out little worlds on each deck. A group of sailors from the tug sat with their backs against the cabin, speaking low. They had run out of adjectives by noon and now swapped nouns. Chain, wake, pull kick, heave, hold. Words that in peacetime mean work now meant survival. The lieutenant came by and thanked them without speeches. He said, "Tomorrow we will adjust the bridle and splice in the heavier links we saved for after the fight." A man asked, "Why not before?" The lieutenant answered honestly, "Because before we were guessing, now we are knowing." The man nodded. Knowing is the sweetest ration in war. There is a bridge from this story to futures that will not look like this bay. Jets will scream where gulls once held court. Satellites will watch what once was seen only from a mast. Minds will grow cunning beyond glass vials and pressure caps, yet the engineer's logic remains stubbornly useful. Put something expendable in front of what you love. Test at the edge of danger before you live there. Make leaders eyewitnesses to prototypes. Choose action when delay feeds fear. The nouns change, the sentences hold. At last, imagine the plaque that could sit on a pier if someone cared to put a small sign for a small device. It would not list calibers or famous last words. It would say, "Here, a raft of planks and chain saved more men than it cost." And because it did, an admiral could afford to be remembered for bravery instead of for caution. It would add no flourish. It would then rust. People would walk past and not read it, because the hero of this scene is not shiny. That is appropriate. Shiny heroes already have their statues. Today, the raft gets its minute and then returns to the water where its virtue was practiced, which is silence following noise.